Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that rarely makes headlines anymore, yet quietly defined decades of global politics: Cuba after the missile crisis. A story not of explosions and invasions, but of slow suffocation, geopolitical stalemate, and the strange grinding tension of a conflict frozen in time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. October 1962. The world held its breath. Soviet ships steaming toward Cuba, American warships forming a blockade, nuclear missiles aimed at cities across the United States. For 13 days, humanity stood on the edge of annihilation, staring into the abyss, wondering if tomorrow would even come. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Khrushchev blinked. The missiles were withdrawn. Kennedy claimed victory. The world exhaled. Crisis averted. Disaster avoided. History pivoted away from the brink. But here's the thing about crises that end without catastrophe. Once the cameras leave, once the diplomats shake hands and the newspapers move on to the next story, the underlying problems don't vanish. They don't dissolve into relief and goodwill. They calcify. They harden into permanent fixtures of the global order, accepted, ignored, and occasionally glanced at with mild irritation. And that's exactly what happened to Cuba. The missile crisis didn't resolve anything. It simply froze the conflict in place. Cuba remained communist, fiercely so. The United States remained hostile, aggressively so. The Soviet Union remained involved, strategically so. But the drama was over. The danger, at least the immediate world-ending kind, had passed. What replaced it wasn't peace, it was something far stranger. A decades-long standoff characterized not by violence, but by boredom. Not by explosions, but by economic suffocation. Not by invasion, but by isolation. Cuba became a geopolitical curiosity, a communist island 90 miles from Florida, surviving on stubbornness, Soviet subsidies, and the sheer refusal to collapse. The United States imposed an embargo so comprehensive that it became one of the longest-running economic sieges in modern history, and yet, Cuba endured. Not thriving, not flourishing, but enduring. A strange, liminal existence where nothing changed dramatically, but nothing resolved either. This is the story of what happened after the headlines faded, after the missiles left, after the world stopped watching. It's the story of Cuba in the long, slow decades that followed the missile crisis. A story of survival, resentment, defiance, and the quiet, grinding weight of a conflict that never quite ended, but never quite continued, either. A story of geopolitical boredom, punctuated by moments of tension, always simmering, never boiling over. A story of what happens when a crisis becomes a status quo. When the Soviet ships turned back in October 1962, the immediate threat evaporated. But the underlying reality remained unchanged. Cuba was still communist, Fidel Castro was still in power, and the United States was still furious. The missile crisis had been resolved through negotiation, backroom deals, and mutual fear of annihilation. But no one involved felt satisfied. The Americans felt humiliated that Soviet missiles had been placed so close to their shores in the first place. The Soviets felt embarrassed by the public retreat. And Castro, perhaps most of all, felt betrayed. You see, Castro wasn't consulted in the final negotiations. Khrushchev made the decision to withdraw the missiles without asking Cuba's permission. The Soviet leader traded the missiles in Cuba for an American promise not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. It was a reasonable deal from Moscow's perspective, but from Havana's perspective, it was a betrayal. Castro had welcomed the missiles as protection, as leverage, as proof that Cuba mattered on the world stage, and now they were being withdrawn without his input, reducing him to a pawn in a superpower chess game. Castro was furious. He ranted. He raged. He accused the Soviets of cowardice. He reportedly kicked walls, threw objects, and spent days in a sulking fury that alarmed even his closest advisors. But there was nothing he could do. Cuba was dependent on Soviet aid, Soviet oil, Soviet trade. Without Moscow's support, the island would collapse. So Castro swallowed his pride, accepted the outcome, and began the long, bitter process of learning to survive in a world that had moved on from caring about Cuba's fate. The United States, for its part, had no intention of normalizing relations. Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba was conditional, vague, and hardly reassuring to Havana. The CIA continued covert operations, sabotage, assassination plots, propaganda campaigns. The goal wasn't invasion anymore, it was destabilization. The hope was that internal pressure, economic hardship, and external meddling would eventually topple Castro's regime from within. But Castro didn't fall. He dug in. He tightened his grip on power. He purged potential opponents. He built a security apparatus that made dissent dangerous and escape difficult. And he leaned harder into his alliance with the Soviet Union, not because he loved Moscow, but because he had no other choice. Cuba became a client state, dependent on subsidies, oil shipments, and trade agreements that kept the economy afloat despite American hostility. The missile crisis ended, but the siege began. Not a military siege with tanks and trenches, but an economic one. A slow, grinding campaign designed not to invade Cuba, but to strangle it, to isolate it, to make survival so painful that the Cuban people would eventually turn on Castro themselves. It didn't work, but it didn't stop either, and so began the long, strange twilight of post-crisis Cuba, a nation trapped between defiance and dependence, survival and stagnation. The international reaction to the resolution of the missile crisis was mixed and deeply revealing. The superpowers claimed victory, each spinning the outcome to suit their domestic audiences. Kennedy portrayed the crisis as American resolve forcing Soviet retreat. Khrushchev emphasized that he had secured a promise not to invade Cuba and quietly removed a threat to Soviet security. Both leaders framed themselves as peacemakers who had pulled humanity back from the brink. But beyond Washington and Moscow, the world saw something different. The crisis had exposed how close civilization had come to annihilation over a conflict that, to many observers, seemed avoidable. The fact that two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, held the power to destroy the world terrified people everywhere. The missile crisis didn't just reshape Cuban-American relations, it reshaped global consciousness about nuclear weapons, deterrence, and the fragility of peace. For Latin America, the crisis was a wake-up call. Many countries in the region had watched nervously as the superpowers played chicken with nuclear weapons in their backyard. Some governments sympathized with Cuba's right to self-defense. Others feared that Castro's revolutionary zeal would spread to their own territories. The crisis deepened divisions across the hemisphere. Left-leaning governments and movements saw Cuba as a beacon of resistance. Right-wing dictatorships, often supported by the United States, saw Cuba as a cancer that needed to be contained. The Organization of American States, which had expelled Cuba in 1962, shortly before the crisis, became a battleground for these competing visions. The United States used the OAS to legitimize its isolation of Cuba, pushing member states to sever diplomatic and economic ties with Havana. Most complied, though reluctantly. Mexico notably refused, maintaining diplomatic relations with Cuba throughout the Cold War, a stance that irritated Washington, but reflected Mexico's own revolutionary history and independent foreign policy. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath of the missile crisis was politically damaging. Khrushchev's handling of the situation was seen by many in the Kremlin as weak and reckless. He had placed the missiles in Cuba without adequate preparation for the American response. He had then backed down publicly, creating the perception of Soviet weakness. Within 2 years, Khrushchev was removed from power, replaced by the more cautious and bureaucratic leadership of Leonid Brezhnev. The missile crisis had humiliated the Soviet leadership, and they were determined never to be caught in such a vulnerable position again. This determination led to a massive Soviet military build-up. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviets expanded their nuclear arsenal, modernized their navy, and invested heavily in missile technology. They were determined to achieve strategic parity with the United States, to ensure that no American president could ever again dictate terms from a position of overwhelming superiority. The missile crisis, ironically, accelerated the arms race it had briefly seemed to diffuse. Cuba, meanwhile, found itself in an awkward position internationally. It was celebrated by anti-imperialist movements as the small nation that had stood up to the United States. Castro became a hero to revolutionaries across the developing world. But Cuba was also isolated, cut off from much of the Western Hemisphere, dependent on Soviet goodwill and unable to shape its own destiny. The island had become a symbol, but symbols don't feed people or build economies. Castro understood this. He knew that Cuba's survival depended on remaining relevant. If the world forgot about Cuba, if the island became just another poor Caribbean nation struggling in obscurity, then the revolution would lose its meaning. So Castro worked tirelessly to keep Cuba in the global spotlight. He gave speeches at the United Nations, hosted conferences of non-aligned nations, supported revolutionary movements abroad, and positioned himself as the voice of the oppressed. It was exhausting, expensive, and often ineffective, but it kept Cuba visible. In February 1962, just months before the missile crisis, President Kennedy signed an executive order that would define Cuba's fate for decades. The United States imposed a comprehensive trade embargo on the island, cutting off nearly all commercial, economic and financial transactions between the two countries. At the time, it was framed as a temporary measure, a way to pressure Castro into abandoning communism. But temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent, and this one outlasted Kennedy, outlasted the Cold War, and outlasted the Soviet Union itself. The embargo, or as the Cubans called it, el bloqueo, the blockade, was one of the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever imposed. It prohibited American companies from trading with Cuba. It banned Cuban goods from entering the United States. It restricted travel. It froze Cuban assets held in American banks. And most devastatingly, it pressured other countries not to trade with Cuba either, threatening penalties for any nation or corporation that did business with the island. At first, the impact was manageable. Cuba had the Soviet Union. Moscow provided oil, machinery, food, and cash. Soviet trade replaced American trade. Soviet technicians replaced American advisors. Soviet ideology replaced American influence. Cuba became part of the socialist bloc, integrated into the network of communist economies that spanned Eastern Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. The embargo hurt, yes, but it didn't cripple, not yet. But the embargo's real power wasn't immediate, it was cumulative. Year after year, decade after decade, it wore Cuba down. Spare parts for machinery became impossible to find. Medical supplies had to be smuggled or substituted. Technology lagged. Infrastructure aged. The economy stagnated. Cuba couldn't modernize because it couldn't access global markets. It couldn't compete because it couldn't trade freely. It became an economic island in more ways than one, geographically isolated and politically quarantined. The United States justified the embargo as a defense of democracy, a stand against communism, a punishment for a regime that had seized American property and aligned itself with the Soviet Union. But for ordinary Cubans, the embargo wasn't an abstract policy debate. It was daily life. Empty shelves, rationed goods, crumbling buildings, shortages of everything from gasoline to toothpaste. The embargo didn't topple Castro. It punished the people instead. Castro, of course, used the embargo brilliantly. He turned it into a rallying cry, a symbol of American imperialism, proof that the United States wanted to destroy Cuba. Every shortage, every hardship, every broken down bus could be blamed on el bloqueo. And he wasn't entirely wrong. The embargo did strangle Cuba's economy. It did make life harder. It did isolate the island. Castro's propaganda didn't have to exaggerate. The embargo spoke for itself. The mechanics of the embargo were complex and far-reaching. American companies were prohibited from doing any business with Cuba, even through third-party countries. Ships that docked in Cuban ports were banned from entering American ports for 6 months, effectively forcing shipping companies to choose between Cuba and the far more lucrative American market. Banks that processed transactions involving Cuba risked massive fines. The embargo wasn't just a bilateral restriction. It was designed to have extraterritorial reach, punishing anyone, anywhere, who dared trade with the island. This extraterritorial enforcement created significant international friction. European countries, Canada, and Latin American nations resented American attempts to dictate their trade policies. They argued that the embargo violated international law and sovereignty. But American economic power was too significant to ignore. Companies that wanted access to American markets complied with the embargo, even when their own governments objected. The result was that Cuba found itself increasingly isolated, not just from the United States, but from the entire Western economic system. Over the years, the embargo became less about achieving a specific goal and more about maintaining a symbolic stance. It was too politically risky for American presidents to lift it. The Cuban exile community in Florida, fiercely anti-Castro and politically powerful, demanded its continuation. Any politician who suggested easing the embargo faced accusations of being soft on communism, soft on dictators, or insufficiently supportive of human rights. So the embargo stayed. Not because it worked, but because removing it was harder than keeping it. The United Nations condemned the embargo repeatedly. Year after year, the General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to end it. By the 1990s and 2000s, the votes were often 180-something to 2, with only the United States and Israel voting against the resolution. Sometimes a few small Pacific Island nations would abstain. But the message was clear. The world opposed the embargo. It saw it as counterproductive, cruel, and outdated. But the embargo remained. American law locked it in place, and Congress showed no interest in changing it. Cuba became a test case in the limits of economic warfare. Could sanctions alone topple a regime? The answer, it turned out, was no. But they could make life miserable for generations. They could stunt economic growth, prevent modernization, and create a permanent state of scarcity. The embargo didn't destroy Cuba, trapped it in a kind of suspended animation, unable to collapse but unable to thrive. The embargo wasn't just an economic tool, it was a statement, a declaration that Cuba would not be forgiven, not be normalized, not be welcomed back into the hemisphere's good graces. It was punishment without end, a policy frozen in the Cold War and never thawed. And for Cuba, it became the defining reality of the post-crisis era. Not missiles, not invasions, but isolation. Slow, grinding, unrelenting isolation. While the United States tightened the noose economically, Cuba didn't simply sit and suffer. Castro, ever the revolutionary, refused to be contained. If Washington wanted to isolate him, he would break that isolation by any means necessary. And so, Cuba became something unexpected. A sponsor of revolution, an exporter of ideology, a small island nation punching far above its weight in the global struggle between capitalism and communism. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Cuba sent soldiers, advisors, weapons and trainers to revolutionary movements across Latin America, Africa and even parts of Asia. Castro believed, perhaps genuinely, that the future belonged to socialism. He also understood that spreading revolution served a strategic purpose. The more allies Cuba had, the less isolated it would be. The more conflicts it could ignite, the more the United States would be distracted. Cuba couldn't defeat America, but it could annoy it, endlessly. In Latin America, Cuban support flowed to guerrilla movements in Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Cuban trainers taught insurgents how to fight, how to organize, how to survive in hostile terrain. Cuban weapons, often supplied by the Soviet Union, armed revolutionaries who might not have stood a chance otherwise. Che Guevara, Castro's former comrade, and the romantic face of the Cuban Revolution, became the symbol of this effort, travelling to Bolivia in 1967 to spark a continental uprising. It failed spectacularly. Che was captured and executed by Bolivian forces advised by the CIA. But the message was clear. Cuba wasn't backing down. The failure in Bolivia was a blow to Castro, both personally and strategically. Che had been more than a comrade. He had been the idealistic heart of the revolution, the man who truly believed in global socialist transformation. His death exposed the limits of Cuba's revolutionary export. Peasants in Bolivia didn't rise up to support the guerrillas. Local communist parties were often hostile or indifferent, and the United States, through the CIA and local allies, proved effective at crushing insurgencies before they could gain momentum. But Castro didn't give up. He simply shifted focus. If Latin America wasn't ready for revolution, then perhaps Africa was. And so, in the 1970s, Cuba embarked on one of the most ambitious and unlikely military adventures in modern history. It sent tens of thousands of troops to Africa fighting wars on behalf of socialist movements thousands of miles from home. In Africa, Cuba's involvement became even more significant and more controversial. Castro sent tens of thousands of troops to Angola in the 1970s, supporting the Marxist MPLA government against South African-backed forces and rival factions backed by the United States and China. Cuban soldiers fought in Ethiopia, helping the Derg regime repel a Somali invasion. They deployed to Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and other newly independent nations struggling with colonial legacies and Cold War proxy conflicts. These weren't small advisory missions, they were full-scale military deployments. At the height of Cuba's involvement in Angola, over 30,000 Cuban troops were stationed there, fighting a war thousands of miles from home. Cuban soldiers, many of them young conscripts who had never left the island before, found themselves in the jungles and deserts of Africa, fighting and dying for causes they barely understood. Why did Cuba do this? The motivations were complex and layered. Partly ideology. Castro genuinely believed in spreading socialism and supporting liberation movements fighting against colonialism and apartheid. He saw Cuba's African interventions as a continuation of the anti-imperialist struggle, a way to stand with oppressed peoples against Western domination. Partly pragmatism. Supporting revolutionaries abroad kept Cuba relevant, kept Soviet aid flowing, and kept the United States off balance. The Soviets appreciated Cuba's willingness to do the dirty work of supporting socialist movements, and they rewarded Havana with continued subsidies. And partly pride. Cuba, a small island nation, was playing on the global stage, shaping conflicts, influencing outcomes, defying expectations. For Castro, that mattered deeply. The Angolan intervention was particularly significant. Cuba's military support helped the MPLA survive and consolidate power. Cuban troops fought effectively against South African forces, winning several key battles that demonstrated their capability and commitment. The intervention also had symbolic importance. Black Cuban soldiers fighting against apartheid South Africa resonated powerfully in Africa and among anti-racist movements globally. Cuba positioned itself as a champion of African liberation, and that reputation earned it goodwill that persisted long after the troops came home. But the interventions came at a tremendous cost. Thousands of Cuban soldiers died in foreign wars. Tens of thousands more returned home with physical and psychological scars. Families lost sons, brothers, fathers, and the resources poured into these conflicts — weapons, transportation, supplies, salaries — were resources that couldn't be used to improve life in Cuba. Schools needed repairs, hospitals needed equipment, infrastructure was crumbling, but the money went to Africa instead. The United States watched all of this with growing frustration and alarm. Cuba wasn't supposed to be a power, it was supposed to be isolated, weakened, contained. Instead, it was stirring up trouble across 3 continents. American intelligence agencies tracked Cuban activities obsessively. The CIA funded counterinsurgency operations, trained anti-communist militias, and supported governments fighting Cuban-backed rebels. The Cold War, supposedly resolved peacefully after the missile crisis, continued in proxy battles fought in jungles, deserts, and mountains far from Washington and Havana. The proxy conflicts created strange bedfellows and bizarre contradictions. In Angola, Cuban troops fought alongside Soviet advisors against forces supported by the United States, South Africa, and China. Yes, China. The Sino-Soviet split had complicated Cold War alignments, and by the 1970s, China and the Soviet Union were bitter rivals. Cuba, firmly in the Soviet camp, found itself opposed by Chinese-backed factions. The neat binary of the Cold War, East versus West, communist versus capitalist, had fractured into a chaotic multipolar struggle. Cuba's African adventures also strained its relationship with Moscow. The Soviets weren't always enthusiastic about Cuba's interventions. They worried about the costs, the risks of escalation, and the unpredictability of Castro's ambitions. But they tolerated and supported the deployments because they served Soviet strategic interests. Africa was a Cold War battleground, and having Cuban troops fighting on the socialist side advanced Soviet goals without requiring direct Soviet involvement. Still, the strategy worked, at least partially. Cuba survived. It remained a thorn in America's side. It built alliances, however fragile, with revolutionary movements and socialist governments, and it avoided the fate that Washington predicted: collapse. By exporting revolution, Cuba imported just enough legitimacy and support to endure. But exporting revolution didn't solve Cuba's domestic problems. The economy still struggled, the embargo still choked, and the dependency on Soviet aid grew deeper with every passing year. Cuba's survival wasn't self-sustaining, it was subsidized, and when those subsidies eventually disappeared, the island would face a reckoning. But for now, in the 1970s and early 1980s, Cuba could still pretend it was a revolutionary powerhouse, a small nation with global reach. The illusion wouldn't last forever, but while it did, Castro clung to it fiercely. For all of Castro's defiance, all of Cuba's revolutionary rhetoric, all the speeches about sovereignty and independence, the island's survival depended on one thing: Soviet money. Lots of it. The relationship between Havana and Moscow was never one of equals. It was patron and client, benefactor and dependent, with all the resentment, gratitude, and strategic calculation that relationship entailed. Cuba needed the Soviet Union to survive. The Soviet Union tolerated Cuba because it served Moscow's interests, and both sides knew it. Soviet aid to Cuba was staggering in both scale and consistency. Billions of dollars poured into the island every year. Oil shipments kept the lights on, the buses running, and the economy functioning. Food imports filled the gaps left by agricultural failures and inefficiencies. Machinery, spare parts, construction materials, all came from the Soviet Union or Eastern Bloc countries. Without this lifeline, Cuba would have collapsed within months. The economy simply couldn't sustain itself. The numbers were remarkable. By some estimates, Soviet subsidies to Cuba reached $4 to $6 billion annually by the 1980s. That's an extraordinary amount for a small island nation. It represented a significant percentage of Cuba's GDP, essentially propping up entire sectors of the economy that would otherwise have ceased to function. The Soviets provided oil at heavily subsidized rates, far below world market prices. Cuba, in turn, sold sugar to the Soviet Union at inflated prices, far above what it could command on the open market. These artificial trade arrangements created the illusion of economic viability, while masking the fundamental unsustainability of the system. But it wasn't charity. The Soviet Union gained significant value from the arrangement, or at least it believed it did. Cuba provided a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a base for intelligence operations, a listening post for monitoring American communications and military activities. Soviet naval vessels docked regularly in Cuban ports, particularly at Cienfuegos, where the Soviets maintained a submarine base that allowed them to project power into the Atlantic and Caribbean. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft operated from Cuban airfields, collecting intelligence on American installations in Florida and across the southeastern United States. Cuba was Moscow's window into the Americas, and that access was considered worth the cost. Beyond the strategic advantages, Cuba also served propaganda purposes. The survival of socialism 90 miles from the United States was a powerful symbol for the Soviet Union. It demonstrated that communism could succeed even in the face of American hostility. It inspired leftist movements across Latin America and the developing world. And it embarrassed the United States, showcasing American inability to dislodge a communist government from its own hemisphere. For Moscow, those symbolic and ideological benefits justified the economic burden, at least for a while. Still, the relationship was complicated and often tense. Castro resented being dependent. He bristled at Soviet control, at Moscow's tendency to treat Cuba like a subordinate rather than a partner. The missile crisis had already demonstrated that Soviet interests didn't always align with Cuban interests. Khrushchev had withdrawn the missiles without consulting Castro, sacrificing Cuban concerns for broader Soviet strategy. That betrayal lingered in Castro's memory, fueling his determination to maintain some degree of autonomy even while relying on Soviet support. Moscow, for its part, found Cuba expensive, demanding, and occasionally troublesome. Castro's adventurism in Africa and Latin America drained Soviet resources and created diplomatic complications. His refusal to moderate his rhetoric or soften his stance toward the United States made détente more difficult. Soviet leaders privately complained that Castro was ungrateful, that he took Soviet aid for granted while pursuing reckless policies that served his ego more than socialist interests. And Cuba's economy, despite decades of Soviet investment and technical assistance, never became self-sufficient. It remained a black hole of subsidies, always needing more, never quite standing on its own. The Soviet advisors stationed in Cuba often clashed with their Cuban counterparts. The Soviets brought a bureaucratic, cautious approach to economic management, emphasizing stability and incremental improvement. Castro and his inner circle were more idealistic, more willing to experiment, and more focused on revolutionary purity than economic efficiency. These cultural and ideological differences created friction. Soviet technicians grew frustrated with Cuban inefficiency and resistance to their recommendations. Cuban officials resented Soviet condescension and attempts to impose Soviet models that didn't fit Cuban realities. Yet the arrangement persisted because both sides needed it. Cuba couldn't survive without Soviet aid. The Soviet Union couldn't afford to let Cuba collapse. A failed communist state 90 miles from Florida would be a propaganda disaster, proof that socialism couldn't compete with capitalism, even when protected from direct military intervention. So Moscow kept the money flowing, even as the costs mounted, even as the returns diminished, even as doubts grew about whether Cuba was worth the investment. For ordinary Cubans, Soviet dependency meant something very different. It meant driving Soviet-made Ladas that constantly broke down, their engines sputtering and coughing like dying animals. It meant living in Soviet-designed apartment blocks, massive concrete structures that cracked in the heat, leaked during rains, and offered all the aesthetic charm of a military bunker. It meant enduring a command economy that prioritized ideology over efficiency, central planning over individual initiative, political loyalty over competence. Life improved compared to the chaos of the early revolution. Yes, but it never became comfortable. It became predictable, stable, but stagnant. Cubans knew what to expect. The ration books would arrive each month, allocating precise amounts of rice, beans, cooking oil, and sugar. The buses would run eventually, though you might wait an hour and then see 3 arrive at once. The hospitals provided free healthcare, but they often lacked medicine, equipment, and supplies. The schools offered free education, but the curriculum was rigid, ideologically focused, and disconnected from practical skills needed in the real world. The Soviet presence was visible everywhere. Soviet movies played in Cuban cinemas, dubbed badly and often bewildering to audiences, unfamiliar with Russian cultural references. Soviet technical manuals filled libraries, written in impenetrable bureaucratic language that made even simple repairs complicated. Soviet advisors worked in government ministries, offering guidance that Cuban officials sometimes followed and sometimes ignored. And Soviet tourists, pale and awkward in the Caribbean heat, wandered Havana's streets, gawking at the tropical setting and spending rubles in state-run shops that ordinary Cubans couldn't access. Cuba's economy functioned barely on Soviet life support. Sugar remained the island's primary export, shipped to the Soviet Union at inflated prices as part of trade agreements that defied all market logic. In return, Cuba received oil at subsidized rates, far below global prices. The entire arrangement was artificial, unsustainable, held together by geopolitical necessity rather than economic sense. It was a closed loop that only worked as long as both sides maintained the fiction that it was mutually beneficial, and all the while the clock ticked. The Soviet Union wasn't immortal. Its own economy struggled under the weight of military spending, bureaucratic inefficiency, and stagnant growth. The subsidies it provided to client states like Cuba became harder to justify as Soviet citizens faced their own shortages and hardships. Reformers in Moscow began questioning whether propping up distant allies was worth the cost, whether the Cold War competition was sustainable, whether the entire socialist project might need rethinking. But for now, in the 1970s and early 1980s, the support continued. Cuba remained afloat, dependent, defiant, and trapped in a relationship it couldn't escape. The Soviet Union was Cuba's lifeline, but it was also Cuba's prison. The subsidies kept the island alive, but also kept it from developing genuine economic independence. Cuba had traded American domination for Soviet dependency, and while the ideology was different, the fundamental power imbalance remained unchanged. Castro had freed Cuba from one empire only to become a client of another. While Cuba leaned on Soviet support, the United States continued its campaign of destabilization, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The missile crisis had ended the threat of nuclear war, but it hadn't ended Washington's determination to topple Castro. If anything, the humiliation of having Soviet missiles so close to American soil intensified the desire to remove him. And since a full-scale invasion was off the table, ruled out by Kennedy's promise to Khrushchev, the CIA turned to other methods. Sabotage, assassination plots, economic warfare, propaganda, and covert operations designed to make life as difficult as possible for the Cuban government. Operation Mongoose, launched in late 1961 and intensified after the missile crisis, continued in various forms throughout the 1960s. The goal was simple: create chaos, destabilize the economy, undermine Castro's legitimacy, inspire internal revolt. The methods range from the strategic to the bizarre to the genuinely absurd. CIA operatives sabotaged factories, planted explosives in power stations, and set fire to sugar fields during harvest season. They contaminated shipments of Cuban goods destined for export. They spread propaganda through underground radio broadcasts, leaflets dropped from planes, and messages smuggled into the island. They funded and trained exile groups who launched commando raids from Florida, attacking Cuban coastal installations, bombing infrastructure, and retreating before the Cuban military could respond. The sabotage campaigns did real damage. Sugar harvests, Cuba's economic lifeblood, were disrupted repeatedly. In one particularly effective operation, CIA, agents managed to introduce a virus into Cuba's swine population, forcing the government to slaughter thousands of pigs and creating a meat shortage that lasted months. Factories were destroyed, sometimes spectacularly, with explosions lighting up the night sky and sending plumes of smoke visible for miles. Power stations were bombed, causing blackouts that lasted days and paralysed entire regions. And then there were the assassination plots against Castro himself. Oh, the assassination plots! The CIA tried to kill Castro so many times that it became almost farcical, a darkly comic catalogue of failure and absurdity. Exploding cigars, poisoned pens, contaminated scuba diving suits, dusted with a fungus that would cause a chronic skin disease, a rigged seashell, painted beautifully and placed in an area where Castro liked to dive, designed to explode when he approached. None of it worked. The agency recruited mafia hitmen, reasoning that organised crime had its own grievances against Castro, who had shut down their lucrative casino operations in Havana. The mob took CIA money and weapons, promised results, and delivered nothing. Operatives tried poisoning Castro's food, his drinks, even his cigars, the latter being a particularly appealing target since Castro was famous for his love of Cuban cigars. But Castro's security was too good. His food was tested, his routines were unpredictable, and he seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to survive attempts on his life. Castro himself later joked that if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, he would have won multiple gold medals. Cuban intelligence eventually compiled a list of alleged CIA plots against Castro's life. By some counts, the number exceeded 600. Whether all of them were real, or whether Cuban intelligence inflated the number for propaganda purposes remains debated. But what's certain is that the CIA tried repeatedly, creatively, and unsuccessfully to eliminate him. The failed plots became part of Castro's legend. They fed his narrative of American aggression and imperialism. Each revealed plot, each thwarted assassination, became proof in Castro's telling that the Americans feared him so much they resorted to cartoon villainy. He used the attempts to justify the massive security apparatus he built, the paranoia that permeated Cuban society, and the repression of dissent. If the Americans were trying to kill him, he argued, then vigilance and control were necessary for survival. But not all of the CIA's operations were failures. The sabotage campaigns, while unable to topple Castro, did inflict serious economic damage. They disrupted production, destroyed infrastructure, and forced the Cuban government to divert resources to security and defense. Money that could have been spent on housing, education, or healthcare instead went to protecting factories, guarding power stations, and rebuilding what the saboteurs had destroyed. The constant threat of sabotage created a siege mentality that justified increasing authoritarianism. Castro tightened his grip on power, expanded the internal security apparatus, and created neighborhood watch committees, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution that monitored every street, every block, every apartment building. These committees ostensibly existed to defend against CIA saboteurs and counter-revolutionaries. In practice, they became instruments of social control, ensuring that dissent was reported, criticism was stifled, and loyalty to the revolution was constantly demonstrated. The American strategy wasn't to defeat Cuba militarily, it was to make governance impossible, to ensure that Castro could never deliver the prosperity he promised, to prove that socialism, at least in Cuba, couldn't work, to demonstrate that a communist government so close to the United States would face endless hostility until it collapsed or capitulated. And to some extent, the strategy succeeded. The Cuban economy never thrived. Living standards remained low. Shortages were constant. Infrastructure crumbled faster than it could be repaired. But whether Cuba's struggles were primarily the result of American sabotage, Soviet-style central planning, a comprehensive embargo, or a combination of all three became a matter of endless debate. Cuban officials blamed everything on El Bloqueo and American aggression. American officials blamed everything on communist mismanagement and dictatorship. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. Cuba's problems had multiple causes, both external and internal. The embargo strangled the economy. American sabotage disrupted production. But Cuban government policies, centralized control, resistance to market mechanisms, and prioritization of ideology over efficiency also contributed significantly to the island's economic stagnation. Yet Castro used every attack, every sabotage operation, every assassination attempt to strengthen his political position. Each CIA plot became propaganda gold. Each American raid became evidence of imperialism. Castro turned victimhood into political capital, using external threats to justify internal crackdowns. Dissent became disloyalty, criticism became treason, and the siege mentality, cultivated carefully and reinforced by real CIA operations, ensured that Cubans rallied around the government even when life was hard. The covert war dragged on for years. It achieved nothing decisive. Castro remained in power, the government remained stable, the revolution endured, but the hostility remained entrenched, calcified into the permanent structure of the relationship. The United States couldn't tolerate a communist Cuba. Cuba couldn't forgive American aggression, and so the cycle continued. Sabotage, retaliation, propaganda, and mutual resentment, year after year, decade after decade, grinding forward without resolution. By the 1970s, both sides were exhausted. The CIA scaled back its most aggressive operations, though it never stopped entirely. Budget cuts, congressional oversight following Watergate, and a growing sense that the covert war was pointless led to a reduction in sabotage activities. Cuba, for its part, fortified its defences, expanded its security apparatus, and focused on survival rather than expansion. The covert war didn't end. It couldn't end as long as the fundamental hostility remained. But it faded into the background, another permanent feature of the frozen conflict, another reminder that the missile crisis had resolved nothing. It had simply paused the violence without addressing the hatred underneath. For all the sabotage, all the propaganda, all the covert operations, the most effective American weapon against Cuba wasn't bombs or bullets or exploding cigars. It was boredom, the geopolitical kind. The slow, grinding realization that Cuba didn't matter as much as it thought it did. After the missile crisis, the world moved on. New crises erupted. Vietnam consumed American attention for over a decade. Détente shifted superpower relations in the 1970s. The Middle East exploded into repeated conflicts. And Cuba, once the centre of global tension, the island that had nearly triggered World War III, became a footnote in the ongoing Cold War narrative. This was devastating in a way invasion never could have been. Cuba survived by being important, by being relevant, by being the dangerous communist threat that justified international attention and resources. But by the mid-1970s, Cuba was no longer dangerous. It was predictable. The embargo was permanent but routine. The revolution was stable but stagnant. Castro was defiant but aging. Cuba had become a frozen conflict, a Cold War relic that everyone acknowledged but no one cared about anymore. For Castro, this irrelevance was intolerable. He had built his entire identity around defiance. around standing up to the Americans, around being the underdog who refused to surrender. But defiance requires an audience. It requires someone to defy. And the world had stopped watching. Cuba's revolutionary energy, once electric and inspiring, had calcified into bureaucracy and routine. The passion of the early years, when everything seemed possible and the revolution felt like it was remaking society from the ground up, had been replaced by the monotony of managing shortages and maintaining political control. Daily life in Cuba during the 1970s and 1980s reflected this profound stagnation. Cubans went to work in state-run enterprises where productivity was low and motivation lower. They stood in lines, endless lines, for rationed goods that were often inferior in quality and insufficient in quantity. They attended mandatory political meetings where the same revolutionary slogans were repeated until they lost all meaning. They listened to speeches about the revolution's achievements, about solidarity with oppressed peoples, about resistance to imperialism. And then they went home to deal with broken plumbing, unreliable electricity, buildings that hadn't been maintained in decades, and the quiet, creeping sense that nothing was going to change. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The ration book, La Libreta, became the symbol of this era and the defining feature of Cuban economic life. Every Cuban family had one. It was a small booklet, updated monthly, that dictated how much rice, beans, cooking oil, sugar, coffee, and other staples they could purchase from state-run stores at subsidized prices. The rations weren't generous. A family of 4 might receive 5 pounds of rice per month, a pound of beans, a small bottle of cooking oil, and a few ounces of coffee. It was enough to survive, barely, but not enough to thrive or enjoy variety in diet. The rations were predictable, and in a strange way that predictability became a kind of stability. People knew what to expect. They knew exactly what they could get and when. There were no surprises, no sudden improvements, but also no complete collapses. The system was designed to provide a baseline of survival for everyone, regardless of income or employment, and in that sense it succeeded. No one starved. But no one flourished either, but the ration system couldn't provide everything people needed or wanted. So Cubans developed elaborate strategies to supplement their official rations. The black market, operating openly despite being officially illegal, became essential to daily life. You could buy extra food, clothing, household items, anything, if you had the connections and the money. Dollars were especially valuable, sent by relatives living in the United States. Those with access to dollars lived far better than those dependent solely on Cuban pesos. This created a two-tier economy that deeply contradicted the revolution's egalitarian promises. People working in tourism, or with family abroad, accumulated wealth that ordinary state workers could never achieve. A taxi driver earning tips in dollars might make more in a day than a doctor earned in a month. This growing inequality, hidden beneath the surface of official rhetoric about equality and solidarity, bred resentment and cynicism. Cubans learned to work within the system, to navigate its complexities and contradictions. They bartered, they traded favours, they hustled. Survival became an art form, a daily exercise in creativity and resourcefulness. Need a part to fix your refrigerator? You traded with someone whose cousin worked in a repair shop. Need extra rice for a family gathering? You called in a favour from someone who had extra to spare from their ration. The informal economy, built on relationships and reciprocity, became as important as the official one. The stagnation bred deep, pervasive cynicism. Cubans stopped believing the government's promises. They stopped listening, really listening, to the revolutionary slogans repeated endlessly in speeches, newspapers, and mandatory meetings. They learned to nod along, to repeat the approved phrases when necessary, to avoid trouble by appearing loyal. But privately they grumbled. They complained. They joked, because humour became a form of resistance, a way to cope with absurdity. Cuban humour during this period was dark, biting, and clever. Jokes about shortages, about the disconnect between official propaganda and daily reality, about Castro's endless speeches circulated quietly. One famous joke: a man visits a butcher shop. "Do you have meat?" he asks. "No, we don't have fish," the butcher replies. "The shop that doesn't have meat is across the street." The humour was a survival mechanism, a way to maintain sanity in a system that often felt insane. And yet, despite the cynicism, despite the hardships, Despite the growing sense that the revolution had failed to deliver on its promises, Cuba didn't collapse. People adapted. They endured. They found ways to make life bearable within the constraints imposed by the embargo, the Soviet, dependency, and the government's refusal to reform. They created parallel structures, informal networks of support and exchange that kept households afloat when the official system couldn't. The geopolitical boredom didn't mean Cuba was peaceful or content. It meant the tension was low-grade, constant and invisible. There were no dramatic headlines, no international crises, no summit meetings focused on Cuba's fate. Just the slow grind of survival under conditions that never improved but never quite collapsed either. Cuba became a case study in endurance, a nation that survived not because it thrived, but because it refused to die, because its people were too stubborn, too resourceful, too proud to give up, and the world barely noticed. Cuba had become background noise in the Cold War, a static presence that everyone acknowledged but no one thought about deeply. The island that had once brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war was now just another struggling socialist state, surviving on subsidies, enduring sanctions, and waiting for something, anything, to change. While Cuba struggled through the doldrums of the 1970s and 1980s, the broader Cold War was shifting in ways that would eventually reshape the entire global order. Détente softened superpower tensions. The United States and Soviet Union signed arms control treaties, opened diplomatic channels, established direct communication links, and dialed down the apocalyptic rhetoric of mutual annihilation. Leaders on both sides began talking about peaceful coexistence, about managing competition without risking global destruction. But this thaw, this cautious warming of superpower relations, didn't extend to Cuba. The embargo remained firmly in place. The hostility remained undiminished. Cuba stayed frozen in a Cold War posture, even as the rest of the world moved toward cautious coexistence, toward the acceptance that capitalism and communism might have to share the planet indefinitely. For Cuba, détente felt like yet another betrayal. Just as Khrushchev had traded Cuban interests for Soviet security during the missile crisis, now Brezhnev and his successors were negotiating with the Americans, while Cuba remained isolated, sanctioned, and treated like a pariah. Moscow didn't cut Cuba off completely. The subsidies continued flowing. Soviet ships still docked in Cuban ports. But the attention drifted. Cuba was no longer a flashpoint in superpower competition. It was a cost centre, a strategic asset, yes, but an expensive one whose value was increasingly questioned. As the Soviet Union's own economic troubles deepened throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the cost of supporting Cuba became harder to justify. Soviet citizens stood in lines for basic goods. The Soviet economy stagnated under the weight of military spending, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the inability to innovate or compete with Western technology. And yet billions continued flowing to Cuba, propping up an economy that showed no signs of ever becoming self-sufficient. Cuba responded to this neglect by doubling down on revolutionary ideology and anti-imperialist activism. If the superpowers were abandoning the struggle, if détente meant accommodation and compromise, then Cuba would carry the revolutionary torch forward. Castro positioned himself as the last true revolutionary, the leader who refused to compromise, to soften, to sell out. He continued supporting guerrilla movements in Latin America and military interventions in Africa, even as the global tide shifted away from armed revolution and toward negotiated settlements. He hosted grand conferences of non-aligned nations, gathering leaders from Africa, Asia, and Latin America to discuss alternatives to Cold War polarization. Cuba positioned itself as the voice of the developing world, the champion of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. Castro gave fiery speeches denouncing imperialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, and what he saw as Soviet betrayal of revolutionary principles, and somehow, improbably, he survived, keeping Cuba relevant through sheer force of personality and relentless diplomatic activity. But survival came at an enormous cost. Cuba's economy remained stagnant throughout the 1980s. Living standards stagnated or declined. Infrastructure aged and crumbled. The housing stock deteriorated, with buildings literally falling apart from decades of deferred maintenance. The promise of the revolution, the vision of a prosperous, equal, just society, felt increasingly hollow to ordinary Cubans, especially young people who had grown up after the dramatic early years. Young Cubans who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s didn't remember the excitement of overthrowing Batista. They didn't remember the electricity of the early revolution, when everything seemed possible and the future seemed bright. They didn't personally experience the drama of standing up to the United States during the missile crisis. They only knew the reality of shortages, ration books, crumbling buildings, limited opportunities, and speeches, endless speeches, about sacrifices for the revolution and victories that felt increasingly abstract. Many began to wonder, quietly at first, then more openly, whether the revolution was worth it, whether the sacrifices demanded by the government were justified, whether there might be a better way, a different path, something other than the rigid socialist model that Cuba had followed for decades. These questions were dangerous. Simply asking them openly could lead to being labelled a counter-revolutionary, which brought surveillance, harassment, potential imprisonment, and social ostracism. Emigration became a pressure valve for this growing discontent. Cubans who could leave did, often at great personal cost and considerable risk. The most famous and dramatic example was the Mariel boat lift of 1980, when Castro suddenly announced that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so from the port of Mariel. It was a calculated move, designed to embarrass the United States and rid Cuba of people Castro considered undesirable. Over 125,000 Cubans boarded boats bound for Florida during the Mariel boat lift. The flotilla included pleasure boats, fishing vessels, cargo ships, anything that could float and make the 90-mile journey across the Florida Straits. Some boats were dangerously overcrowded. Some were barely seaworthy. Several sank, drowning those aboard, but tens of thousands made it, arriving in Key West and Miami to uncertain futures in a country many had never seen. The composition of the Mariel exodus was complex and controversial. Some were political dissidents who had openly opposed Castro and faced persecution. Some were criminals Castro deliberately included to embarrass the United States and create social problems in Florida. Most, however, were just ordinary people, families who wanted better opportunities, young people seeking freedom, individuals tired of the shortages and restrictions of Cuban life. They weren't counter-revolutionaries or criminals. They were people who had concluded that Cuba couldn't offer them the future they wanted. Castro framed the exodus as a cleansing, a purging of the unworthy, of those who lacked revolutionary spirit and commitment. But the message was clear and deeply damaging to the revolution's legitimacy. Even after more than 2 decades of socialist rule, even after massive investments in education and healthcare, even after all the speeches about building a new society, many Cubans wanted out. The revolution had failed to create a society compelling enough to make people stay. The Mariel boat lift exposed the contradiction at the heart of the Cuban system. The government claimed to represent the people, to embody their aspirations and defend their interests, but thousands of people were literally risking their lives to escape. That fundamental contradiction, that disconnect between official rhetoric and lived reality, undermined the government's legitimacy in ways no external enemy could. Meanwhile, the United States continued its embargo, continued its hostility, and continued treating Cuba as a pariah state that needed to be punished indefinitely. American policy had calcified into a kind of ritualized punishment, a diplomatic performance repeated year after year regardless of changing circumstances. Every year, Congress reaffirmed the embargo. Every year, the United Nations condemned it. Every year, nothing changed. The policy had long since stopped being about achieving specific goals like promoting democracy or protecting human rights. It had become a symbol, a political sacred cow that no politician dared challenge for fear of alienating the powerful Cuban-American community in Florida. Cuba, in turn, continued blaming all its problems on El Bloqueo and American aggression. And again, it wasn't entirely wrong. The embargo did make life harder. It did limit economic growth. It did prevent Cuba from accessing technology, markets, and capital that could have helped modernize the economy. But the embargo also became a convenient excuse for government failures, for the inefficiencies of central planning, for corruption among officials, for the misallocation of resources, for ideological rigidity that prevented pragmatic solutions. The truth was complicated, nuanced, and politically inconvenient for both sides. Cuba's problems were both external and internal, both imposed and self-inflicted. The embargo strangled growth, but government policies prevented adaptation. American sabotage disrupted production, but centralized planning created inefficiencies that would have existed even without external interference. The reality was that both the United States and Cuba bore responsibility for the island's stagnation. But nuance doesn't make for good propaganda, so both sides stuck to their simplistic narratives, their black and white versions of reality. By the late 1980s, Cuba was trapped in a strange, increasingly unstable limbo. Still communist, still defiant, still dependent on Soviet aid, still isolated by the embargo, still somehow surviving despite conditions that should have led to collapse. The geopolitical boredom continued, the conflict simmered without boiling over, and the world, for the most part, stopped caring about Cuba's fate. Cuba had become a relic, a museum piece from an earlier era of the Cold War, a revolution that had run out of momentum and purpose. The island existed in a kind of suspended animation, unable to move forward, unwilling to move backward, frozen in place by its own ideology and external constraints. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because the Soviet Union, the lifeline Cuba had depended on for 3 decades, the patron whose subsidies kept the entire system afloat, was about to undergo a transformation that would shake the world, and when it collapsed, Cuba would be left utterly alone. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, and everything began to change. He arrived with bold promises of reform, with a vision of modernizing socialism and saving the Soviet Union from stagnation and decay. Glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. These weren't just slogans. They represented a fundamental rethinking of how the Soviet system operated. Gorbachev believed the socialist system could be saved if it adapted, if it embraced transparency, accountability, and efficiency. He believed that rigid centralized control was killing socialism, that the Soviet Union needed to decentralize economic decision-making, allow more market mechanisms, encourage innovation, and open up politically to allow criticism and debate. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but his reforms set in motion events that would shatter the Soviet Empire, end the Cold War, and leave Cuba utterly stranded. Cuba watched these developments with growing alarm and horror. Castro despised Gorbachev's reforms with a passion that bordered on fury. He saw them not as salvation for socialism, but as betrayal of everything the revolution stood for. Socialism didn't need reform in Castro's view. It needed discipline, commitment, ideological purity. Glasnost meant weakness, a betrayal of revolutionary principles. Perestroika meant capitulation to capitalism, an abandonment of the socialist project. And when Gorbachev began cutting subsidies to client states, signalling that they needed to become more self-sufficient, Castro's worst fears were confirmed. The Soviet Union was abandoning the revolution, abandoning Cuba, abandoning the entire anti-imperialist struggle. Throughout the late 1980s, Soviet aid to Cuba declined steadily, not dramatically at first. The cuts were gradual, almost gentle, but the direction was unmistakable. Oil shipments shrank. Trade agreements were renegotiated on less favourable terms. Soviet advisors began leaving. Moscow signalled subtly at first, then more explicitly, that Cuba needed to become more self-sufficient, that the era of unlimited subsidies was ending. The subsidies that had kept Cuba afloat for 3 decades were no longer guaranteed. The lifeline was fraying. And then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It wasn't just a physical barrier that collapsed, it was a symbol, the most potent symbol of the Cold War divide. When East Germans poured through the checkpoints, when the wall was torn down stone by stone, it marked the end of an era. Eastern Europe threw off communist rule in a cascade of peaceful revolutions. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, one after another, the Soviet satellite states abandoned communism and embraced democracy and market economics. The Cold War, for all practical purposes, ended. The ideological struggle that had defined global politics for 4 decades was over, and capitalism had won. Socialism hadn't been defeated militarily. It had collapsed from within, unable to compete economically, unable to satisfy people's aspirations, unable to adapt to changing realities. And in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union itself collapsed. The superpower that had stood as the champion of socialism, that had supported revolutionary movements worldwide, that had propped up Cuba for 3 decades, simply ceased to exist. For Cuba, the collapse of the Soviet Union was nothing short of catastrophic, apocalyptic. Overnight, the island lost its primary trading partner, its main source of oil, its economic lifeline. Soviet subsidies, which had amounted to somewhere between $4 and $6 billion annually, vanished completely. The ships stopped coming. The imports dried up. The oil tankers that had kept Cuba's economy running stopped arriving. The machinery stopped running. Cuba's economy, which had been stagnant for years, now went into absolute free fall. Castro called this period the special period in time of peace, a euphemism so absurd, so darkly comic, that it could only have come from a government desperately trying to downplay a catastrophe. There was nothing special about it. It was a collapse, a crisis of unprecedented severity. It was Cuba's Great Depression, only worse, because it came on top of decades of stagnation and economic isolation. GDP contracted by over 30% within just a few years. Think about that. Nearly a third of the entire economy simply disappeared. Food became scarce. The caloric intake of the average Cuban dropped dramatically. Electricity was rationed to just a few hours a day. Entire neighbourhoods would be dark for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch. Transportation ground to a halt as gasoline ran out. Buses stopped running, cars sat idle. Factories closed because there were no spare parts, no raw materials, no fuel to power the machinery. Hospitals ran out of medicine, antibiotics, surgical supplies, even basic items like gauze and antiseptics. People lost weight. Malnutrition became common. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds during the special period. Children showed signs of stunted growth. Diseases related to vitamin deficiencies appeared. The elderly suffered terribly. It was a humanitarian crisis unfolding 90 miles from the United States, and yet the embargo remained firmly in place, preventing any meaningful relief. Cubans joked bitterly that the special period had one benefit. Everyone got thin. Everyone got fit from riding bicycles everywhere. Dark humour became a coping mechanism, a way to maintain dignity and sanity in the face of deprivation that seemed endless. The government responded with a mixture of desperation, ingenuity, and rigid ideological stubbornness. Agriculture was reorganised almost overnight. Urban gardens sprouted across Havana and other cities. Vacant lots, rooftops, balconies, any available space was turned into vegetable plots. People grew tomatoes, peppers, herbs, anything that could supplement their meagre rations. Oxen replaced tractors, because there was no fuel. The sight of oxen pulling ploughs through fields, a scene from a century earlier, became common again across Cuba. Bicycles became the primary mode of transportation. China donated hundreds of thousands of bicycles, and suddenly Cuban cities were filled with people pedaling to work, to school, to the market. It was healthier, cleaner, but also exhausting and impractical for long distances or for carrying goods. The state encouraged carpooling, though there were few cars running. It rationed electricity to a few hours a day, creating schedules so that different neighbourhoods had power at different times. It urged citizens to endure, to sacrifice, to remain loyal to the revolution even in the darkest hour. Castro gave speeches about resilience, about Cuban creativity and ingenuity, about the need to resist imperialism despite the hardships. But speeches couldn't fill empty stomachs. Ideology couldn't power a refrigerator or cook a meal. Cuba also opened, cautiously and reluctantly, to foreign investment. Tourism became a lifeline, perhaps the only one left. The government built resorts along Cuba's pristine beaches, invited foreign companies from Spain, Canada and elsewhere to manage them, and welcomed tourists from Europe, Canada and Latin America. It was a bitter, painful irony. The revolution had promised to free Cuba from exploitation by foreign capitalists, to end the era when Cuba served as a playground for wealthy Americans. Now the government was inviting foreign capitalists back, building luxury resorts and welcoming tourists because it had no other choice. Tourists sunbathed on beautiful beaches, drank mojitos in air-conditioned hotels, enjoyed buffets with food ordinary Cubans couldn't access, while just miles away, Cuban families struggled to find enough to eat. The contradiction was glaring, impossible to ignore. Tourism created a two-tier economy that made a mockery of revolutionary principles. Those working in tourism had access to dollars, tips, and goods unavailable to ordinary Cubans. Everyone else struggled. The special period exposed the fundamental fragility of Cuba's economy. Decades of dependency on Soviet subsidies had left the island completely incapable of standing alone. There was no diversification, no resilience, no ability to adapt quickly. The economy had been built on the assumption that Soviet support would continue indefinitely. When it disappeared, everything collapsed. The embargo, still rigidly enforced, made recovery infinitely harder. Cuba couldn't trade freely with most of the world. It couldn't access international loans from institutions like the World Bank or IMF. It couldn't purchase spare parts, technology, or raw materials from American companies. It was isolated, broke, desperate, and watching its people suffer. And yet, somehow, impossibly, Cuba survived. The government didn't collapse. Castro didn't fall. There were no mass uprisings, no coups, no foreign invasions taking advantage of Cuba's weakness. Cubans endured. They improvised, they adapted, they hustled, they suffered quietly, grumbled privately, and kept going. The special period was brutal, perhaps the most difficult period in Cuba's post-revolutionary history, but it didn't break the island. It didn't topple the government. It didn't end the revolution. Instead, it became another chapter in Cuba's long, improbable story of survival against overwhelming odds. By the mid-1990s, the worst of the crisis had passed. The economy stabilised, though at a much lower level than before the collapse. Tourism grew steadily, bringing desperately needed hard currency. Remittances from Cuban exiles in the United States became a crucial, perhaps the most crucial source of income for ordinary families. Cubans abroad sent money home, and that money kept families afloat, purchased goods on the black market, and sustained a parallel economy that operated outside state control. The government loosened some economic controls, allowing limited private enterprise for the first time since the early revolutionary period. Small businesses, cuentapropistas, were legalized. Cubans could now legally open small restaurants in their homes called paladas. They could operate as taxi drivers, repair technicians, vendors. It wasn't capitalism, the state insisted firmly. It was socialism adapting to reality, allowing necessary flexibility without abandoning core principles. But everyone understood what it really was. It was survival. It was pragmatism overriding ideology. It was the government acknowledging, without admitting openly, that the old model didn't work, that people needed opportunities the state couldn't provide. Cuba began to breathe again, shallowly and painfully, but steadily. Life remained hard, but it was no longer the desperate daily struggle for survival that characterized the worst years of the special period. But the collapse of the Soviet Union had shattered any remaining illusions about Cuba's revolutionary project. The island was alone now, truly alone. The revolution's great patron was gone, vanished into history. The Cold War was over. The ideological struggle that had given Cuba's suffering meaning and purpose had ended. And Cuba was left adrift, surviving not because it had found a new path forward, not because it had solved its fundamental problems, but because it refused to give up, because Cubans were too stubborn, too resourceful, too proud to simply surrender. The geopolitical boredom continued, deeper and more profound than ever. The embargo remained, an anachronism that made less sense with each passing year but persisted nonetheless. Cuba, battered, traumatized but unbroken, stumbled forward into an uncertain future, carrying the weight of a revolution that had promised everything and delivered something far more complicated.